with the pain and suffering that the Russian people are experiencing due to the war would likely be enough for a popular uprising to get started. The loss of Crimea could be the match that lights the fire within the Russian people. It would be clear that Putin has been lying to citizens.
De fietsverzekering. Wat is het precies? Waarvoor ben je verzekerd en waarvoor niet? In deze video geef ik je antwoord op al deze vragen. Hoi, ik ben Barbara van Interpolis. En bij Interpolis communiceren we alles glashelder.
Entire time that the war was not going according to plan, and that Russia was not as strong under his leadership as he claimed it to be. The population would begin rebelling, tearing the country apart. If Putin had any plans of invading Crimea to take it back, they'd be put on hold, as every available soldier would need to be deployed within Russia itself to stop the uprisings. However, at that point, it would be too late, and if Russia loses Crimea and the Russian people start to revolt, it would be all over for Putin and anyone who allied himself with him.
LJT here.
When
we met online all that time ago.
And the key role it plays in the narrative around rebuilding the Russian empire. If Ukraine's able to retake its land and push Russian forces out, it would most likely lead to the destruction of the status quo in Russia right now. So the question becomes, can Ukraine retake Crimea? And if so, how would they do it? According to President Volodymyr Zelensky, it's not a question of if, but of when. Ukraine must take back everything Russia stole from it, including Crimea. And it seems like Zelensky is going to keep good on his word, as Ukrainian forces have already begun to attack targets on the peninsula. Artillery strikes and missiles have already hit military installations and key strategic locations that Russia holds in Crimea. One of their biggest wins was the attack that damaged the Kerch Strait Bridge, which disrupted the supply lines that Russia was using to get weapons and resources to their troops in the Donbas region of Ukraine. This dealt a huge blow to the Russian war effort, but it also was a personal attack on Putin. We know it sounds crazy, but Putin loved that bridge, like he literally loved it. In 2018, Russian movie makers created the film The Crimean Bridge Made with Love, which is a love story where the Kerch Strait Bridge plays a major role in the plot. Vladimir Putin is a weird dude, but this movie takes things to a whole new level. Like everything else in Russia, the movie was made under the oversight of the Kremlin, and if you're thinking that the movie must be absolutely terrible, you'd be right. In it, a young, darling builder falls in love with a female archaeology student. Unfortunately, a PR man from Moscow brings American television crews to film the Kerch Strait Bridge, which the main character is working on. Somehow, this creates a love triangle that ends up being the fault of the Americans. It's a convoluted love story that includes anti-Western propaganda and is centered around the Kerch Strait Bridge. We honestly can't make this stuff up. Vladimir Putin and his regime are insane and clearly have terrible taste in movies. Back in reality, the destruction of the Kerch Strait Bridge was a huge win for Ukraine. But their victories didn't stop there. While Russia scrambles to dig in and hold the territory that they seized in the initial invasion, Ukrainian forces are continually dealing damage to the Russian war machine. In October 2022, reports came in that Ukraine had launched drones that disabled 3 warships stationed in Sevastopol. Like the Russian tanks and artillery, their naval ships seem to be vulnerable to Ukrainian tactics and weapons. However, even though it's clear that Ukraine is capable of dealing damage to Russian forces from afar, invading the Crimean Peninsula will be a whole other matter. Crimea is connected to mainland Ukraine by a small strip of land that's only 5 miles wide. This means that if Ukraine launches a ground-based attack, they'll have to travel across this checkpoint, which will undoubtedly be heavily fortified by Russian forces. There are other ways to get into Crimea, such as by boat or via airdrops, but an invasion will definitely be costly in terms of lives lost and the number of resources spent to take the peninsula. Right now, Ukraine does not have the aircraft or the amphibious vehicles to make invading Crimea possible, and the leadership likely wouldn't consider trying to take the peninsula until Russian forces have been pushed out of the Donbas region. One way that Ukraine could secure Crimea is if they cut off the supplies coming into the region by destroying the Kerch Strait Bridge and securing the major ports on the peninsula. This obviously will not be easy, but it would allow Ukraine to severely weaken the Russian position in Crimea. If Russia doesn't have the ability to resupply the troops on the peninsula, Ukraine could just continue to bombard key military positions from the mainland and then wait until Russian forces either surrendered or became weak enough that an invasion would be successful. However, Ukraine would need to gain access to medium and long-range missiles to carry out this type of attack successfully. Currently, NATO countries are hesitant to give Ukraine these types of weapons and fear that it might escalate things further. If they had access to long-range missiles, there is the possibility that Ukraine would use these weapons to attack targets deep within Russia, such as Moscow. It seems unlikely, as Ukraine only seems to be focused on retaking the land Russia invaded, but this is war, and Russia has committed countless atrocities in Ukraine ever since it invaded Crimea. If Ukraine got their hands on long-range missiles, they would almost certainly use them to strike targets in Crimea, but there's also a real possibility they would launch them across the border into Russia as well. This brings us to what would happen if Putin felt he was about to lose Crimea. As we already know, this would likely be the end of his brutal dictatorship, and as we also know, Putin will do everything in his power to keep this from happening. So, if the war took a turn for the worst for Russia and Ukrainian forces looked as if they were about to invade Crimea, it's possible Vladimir Putin would escalate things to the next level and use weapons that the world has feared ever since they were first dropped at the end of World War II. Russia has a massive amount of nuclear weapons. It's estimated that Russia has stockpiled around 6,000 nuclear warheads. Some of these are tactical nukes, which have a significantly smaller yield than strategic nuclear weapons. A 1 kiloton tactical nuke would have a blast radius of around 300 yards. This is more than enough to wipe out an entire Ukrainian unit and decimate any armor or structures in the area. A 10 kiloton tactical nuke would have a blast radius a third of a mile, which could destroy entire airfields, bases, or towns. These weapons are terrifying, and if Putin decided to use them, it could lead to a much larger conflict with NATO getting directly involved. Then again, this isn't the scariest scenario. If Ukraine was in a position to successfully take Crimea and Putin knew Russia wouldn't be able to hold the peninsula, he might feel backed into a corner. And we all know what happens when a wild animal feels threatened. It's not out of the realm of possibility that Putin will launch strategic nukes with payloads in excess of 1 megaton. These nuclear weapons could be 1,000 times stronger than the 2 nuclear bombs dropped on Japan in World War II and could wipe out entire cities. There's no doubt Ukraine could take Crimea if they get the weapons and support they need from Western nations. If Crimea was recaptured by Ukraine, it would reunify a nation that had been illegally torn apart by Vladimir Putin back in 2014. However, it would also likely be the end of the current regime's rule. This may be unacceptable for those in power in Russia, which could lead them to do all kinds of crazy things. As much as most of the world wants to see Crimea reunified with Ukraine and the war ended, the retaking of the peninsula by Ukrainian forces could lead to a nuclear war that expands out of the borders of Russia and Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has proven one thing. The United States military would wipe the floor with Russia. No, we're not funded by the CIA, as many have claimed in the comments section. This is simple objective truth. Let's look at why. If you want to evaluate the capabilities of the two militaries, we must first understand the core philosophy of each fighting force. The Russian military has traditionally been a ground power with heavy focus on its army and artillery. With few warm water ports and almost none that would be immediately under threat from NATO forces, Russia and the Soviet Union before it held no illusions that they could become a major maritime power. Back when the US was fielding its first supercarriers, the Soviet Navy wanted to match the capability until they were reminded that to join the fight anywhere outside their immediate shoreline, they'd first have to run a gauntlet of NATO shore-based anti-ship missile batteries. Geography has not been kind to Russia's dreams of being a naval power, which is why it's never been a truly global power at all, period. This means that any future conflict involving Russia and NATO will most likely take place in Eastern Europe. The Russian military is well suited for